When it comes to Egypt, the most recognizable thing about it are the pyramids. And no matter how you look at it, the pyramids themselves do not speak of the most modern thing about Egypt. In fact, they're actually one of the most prehistoric things about Egypt. I mean, think about it. They are ritualistic temples for the dead. In some ways, they're a monumental waste of money. In others, they're a great tourist attraction, and they've been attracting people for thousands of years. Even the ancient Greeks, when they first saw them, realized that they made a mistake by not engaging in feats like this that would easily make other people, including yourself, realize that you were superior in some way. Now, what is the true history that goes behind these pyramids? Were there always triangles? Were there always pyramids? And did they always house the dead? The answers to these questions are not as difficult as we think. There are actually videos that can easily show you what these pyramids were used for, and myths would be thrown to the side immediately. So I've already mentioned that these were tombs. But how far back do tombs really go? Well, it used to be thought that tombs maybe came with farming. Then it was thought that maybe they were pre-farming, but not that far back, because humans probably just discarded the dead or burned them or something like that. But it turns out that that is not the case. In fact, it's obvious that Homo naledi and other hominins from back in the day used to bury their dead. In fact, they used to bury them very far deep into caves. Now remember, a cave is a natural rock formation which makes it almost like a house. You notice that when caves exist in history, the technology sort of jumps from living out in the open. And this is because you basically have a house that doesn't move, that is solid, that's going to be there tomorrow. And all you need is to just develop the area. And there, of course, because it's not going anywhere, they decided to bury their dead. Because they're not going anywhere if the house is going nowhere. Now, this burial evolved over years and years and years, and you can see things from shallow graves to high graves to, of course, the pyramids. But there's an in between. It's kind of a universal thing that you find in every country. By the way, these caves are in South Africa, the ones that show the earliest burials in history. This also means that unlike the pyramids, it wasn't just the important people who were buried, just anybody. And it also gives us ties to spirituality in the fact that there is no logical reason to value a dead person. So the thought that we have today about dead people and spirits and stuff like that must have been there with these hominids long, long time ago. So, how do we get to the pyramids? Well, before we talk about the true inspiration for what gave birth to the pyramids, let's first talk about why is it that almost every pyramid looks like a step pyramid. Remember, we always talk about the pyramids like, okay, there's the step pyramid, and then there's the smooth pyramid, and then there's all of that, but we don't see it. Two reasons. One, neglect. First of all, let's just start with that. There was neglect for these pyramids for a long time, and so there's a lot of wear and tear, but that's not enough to remove bricks. Like bricks don't get removed that way. This will destroy one of the myths that a lot of people make up online, which is that these bricks can't be moved by humans. Well, actually, they can be moved by humans, and we know this because a lot of Arab people and people who lived in Egypt actually took rocks from the pyramid to build their houses. In other words, they came to the pyramids. The pyramids that you can see was a great quarry. You could just go over there, pick you a brick, cut you and your friends, cut yourself a little piece, or pull out one that is easily sticking out and go build yourself something. And you can see that they didn't just do this for the bottom base, they did it for the top too. Now, there is something to be said with the fact that no matter how many bricks they took, there still was so much left over, meaning that it wouldn't have been so easy to completely rip it. But I promise you, if the Egyptian government at some point just said, hey, whoever wants to, as long as you don't use modern technology, you can take, no matter who you are in the world, you can come take any piece of the pyramid. I bet you that within years, it would be, yeah, there would be a lot of bricks missing. But let's not talk about that for a second. Let's talk about where it came from. So, human beings have always buried their dead. Sometimes they burn them, sometimes they discard them, put them in a giant mound. And this is where the story gets interesting. About 6,000 BC to about 4,000 BC, we find interesting things all over Central and North Africa. What we find in places like Niger and even closer places closer to Egypt and North Africa, but this one being one of the earliest, about 4,700 BC, is, as you can see there, they call them tumulus, but we don't need to use that word because it's just a translated word meaning mound. What we find are mounds, in other words, burial places in which earth has been used, not normal earth, but earth has been used to cover the graves of people, and even having sort of places or directed places to put in grave goods. And we're talking about all kinds of objects from pottery. The oldest ones have pottery, they have, you know, old materials from the old world, which would be nothing if we didn't find the exact same thing in Egypt prior to the mastabas, which the mastabas would be the first event or the first structure that resemble the pyramids and would go on to become the pyramids. But before that, we would find mounds, and these mounds would have people inside them. And you can find them in Niger, some of the oldest, but it is presumed that there are older ones still in North Africa, but that's a presumption. But we do find a lot in North Africa. We also find them in East Africa, but some of the East African ones are more modern, and we even find Greek artifacts inside and Greco-Roman artifacts inside, showing that they are way more modern. Now, something interesting about this date is that it lines up perfectly with Anjagao. Now, if you don't know what this place is, it's in Nigeria, and it's the place where the oldest pottery in Africa was discovered. And this pottery would be transferred from this region all over Africa. And of course, there was some later introduction of pottery from other places, but we know that the earliest pottery that got distributed throughout Africa came from this one location. And a lot of studies have been done on this. The thing about it, and a lot of historians now call it pre-technology, the thing about it, the pre-technology of this location specific, pre-farming, pre all of that in this specific location, makes it obvious that everything sort of started in this region for these people, and these mounds, and which were probably copying natural formations, these mounds would keep some of the things that we thought you couldn't find. Without these mounds, Africa would have just had, I don't know, people would have just said, no, the technology is from today, it's recent, because it would be mixed with recent things. But thanks to these people burying their things in both natural and unnatural locations, when they were moved by waters or discovered by accident, then we found out that they were pretty old. How old? We're talking 10,000 BC. Now, 10,000 BC is an interesting age because it goes back to the greening of the Sahara. And so these people would have been able to move from Nigeria to Egypt to Libya to Tunisia easier than they did today. But there's also another thing, and that thing is called not stand still human beings. Human beings do not stand still in more than one way. In the first way, they move around. And of course, we find a very old ship, again in West Africa, showing that boats were to have been invented as far back as about this time. And where did they go? And of course, the assumption by the people who study boats is that this boat concept would have contributed to other boat ideas in Africa, including Egypt. As we can see here, if we read, the Yami River in the Bandiagara Plateau, Dogon Country, Mali, is characterized by extensive alluvial sedimentary records, particularly in the 1 kilometer long Onjongo Reach, where Holocene floodplain pockets are inset in the Pleistocene formations. These alluvial records have been investigated via geomorphologic fieldwork and sedimentologic and micromorphologic analysis, and are supported by 79 radiocarbon dates. The alluvial deposits of the valley floor correspond to a vertical accretion of 3 to 10 meters. The reconstruction of fluvial style changes provides evidence of four main aggradation periods from 11,500 to 8,700 BP before present. The alluvial architecture and grain size parameters indicate a wandering river. This period includes phases of pulsed high energy floods and avulsion related to a northwards shift of the summer monsoon to around 14 degrees north after 11,500 col BP, from 7,800 to 5,300 BP, a swampy floodplain environment with standing water pools within a Sudanian savanna woodland mosaic correspond to the culmination of the Holocene humid period. From 3,800 BP onwards, rhythmic sediments attest to an increase in duration and/or intensity of the dry season, giving a precise date of the local termination of the Holocene optimum period during the last two millennia. And for the first time during the Holocene, the alluvial formations are progressively restricted, whereas the collovial deposits increase, indicating strong soil erosion and redeposition within the watershed related to an increase in human impact. Four major periods are characterized by incisions pointing to dramatic changes in fluvial style. They result from high energy flood flows during dry spells and confirm the capacity of the floodplain pocket in the upstream reach of the Sahelian belt to record rapid Holocene climate change. There are many other evidences all over Central and North Africa that show that there were wild animals that you could find anywhere in Africa that, today you can only find in the very southern regions of Africa because of the environmental change. But if we look at some place like Chad, for example, we will see the two things that would lead to this. Firstly, we see the mounds, and then secondly, we see the development in technology, meaning that the pottery has moved from the West African regions into the Central African regions. And so, presumably, or if we take a presumption, we will find that there's two routes that was taken. One through the Sahara, and the second one through Chad. Now, was there a giant population shift? Perhaps not, for two reasons. One, because genetically the people of East Africa are very different than the people of West Africa. And so the answer is probably that there was a transfer of technology from East Africa to West Africa, with obviously some transfer. Now, also, linguistically, there would have been a die out because most East Africans do not speak anything close to West African languages. But there is an exception, which is the Afro-Asiatic language, which we do see being transferred from East Africa all the way to West Africa. The Afro-Asiatic language, we're going to recount it again: North Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, and Egypt. It almost hits as not a coincidence that we do not find the Afro-Asiatic language, at least its origins, anywhere in Southern Africa. So, in other words, starting from about Congo down, we don't really find the Afro-Asiatic languages. We start to find Twa languages, we start to find Bantu languages, and Khoisan languages, and other groups, but we do not find Afro-Asiatic languages, which speaks to this transfer of technology in a way. So now we've got like three directions, and this is all to lead to the mounds. Remember, it's all about burials. How do you transfer it? Well, we've got a linguistic transference. We've got a environmental transference, or an environmental blending, or an environmental setting that is right for movement. And then we have pottery starting somewhere, because a lot of people thought pottery would have started in Egypt, but it didn't. It started in West Africa, in Africa. And then we have early pre-farming in West Africa, in Central Africa, in Central meaning Chad, in those regions, that then is pushed to other parts. And of course, again, some Middle Easterners came in and brought their own spin to the culture. But prior to that culture, or prior to that spin, there was already something brewing in Africa. So if we look at the earliest burial sites in Egypt, the first thing you'll notice is that they've got this reddish, rustish look on them, including their hair, which has become yellowish. This is due to, in the, being buried, naturalized mummies is what they were, pre-dynastic Egypt. But you will notice that around them there's something interesting. Tons of pottery. Some of the pottery is painted and has pictures, obviously. And of course, these are excavated, so some of them are not as they would have been found. But there's two things that are interesting, which is the pottery. The pottery and the fact that the pottery, the red with the black top, is undecorated. It has nothing new on it. It has no Egyptian anything about it. It just looks like piece of pottery. Now, what we do know is that this process of making this pottery, the black stuff on it, is not some accident. It actually cools the red one so it helps it dry in a specific way. This is interesting because we find this same burial practice in the Meroitic areas and all the way down south in Nubia and even lower to like the Ethiopian regions. But who cares, right? If there's just blacktop earthenware, who cares? Like what does that do? The fact that there's like pottery that has blackness on it and it's shared. Maybe they got it from Egypt. So what happens? Well, the reason why it matters is because at one point this pottery was used exclusively for burials, unlike the other pottery, which presumably would have been used in several areas. Now, of course, when I say exclusively, I mean these ones, not all that would have been made like that, because we do find in other places them being used, but these ones would have not been used in life. In other words, they would have been made just for putting in the grave. And so we've connected pottery to death. And this is where the pyramids would start getting their thing, because these graves are not impressive at all compared to what happened. And even if you compare them to some of the ones that you find in Niger, already you find sections there, where these ones it's kind of like body and then things around it. And you will find this later in other places in Africa. Like, this is just how they bury people. And so it says black topped ware is a common pre dynastic pottery type regarded as typical of the Nakada first and second periods in Upper Egypt in Nakada the second and second D. It is less common, and by Nakada 3, only isolated examples are found in the Nile Valley. However, a small body of material shows that black topped ware was produced in early dynastic Egypt. Period. And possibly the Old Kingdom. Using the same firing technique, the range of shapes was limited and the function of the vessel more specific. This study examines black topped ware from this time, showing that by the early third millennium it had become a very specialized type used exclusively for ritual and funerary purposes. Pre-dynastic black-topped ware found in the Nile Valley cemeteries and settlements had both a utilitarian and funerary function, made of Nile silt and fashioned by coils or slabs. The exterior surface was usually coated with a red ochre slip, then burnished before firing. Anyway, we don't need to read the whole thing, but we can see here that clearly the thing that, by the way, is still used today in Sudanic areas is pre-dynastic, meaning that the people who live south of Egypt, very south of Egypt, carry on a tradition that the Egyptians kind of abandoned pre-dynastically. If ever there was a way of showing that something is connected to another, this is it. Okay, fine. So there's clearly some East African connection between the burials and pottery that would have started in West Africa and then got passed to East Africa. But how does that connect to West Africa? Well, throughout West, East, North, and even Egypt, although because of industrialization in Egypt it became a little different. But before that, throughout the entire regions, the job of making pottery was that of females, girls, as well as grown women, meaning that little girls were responsible for making the ware. And of course, this wasn't just their only job, they were responsible for making houses out of straw or clay and all of that. And that's just customary throughout Africa. And this shows that there wasn't a big difference between East or West, no matter what language they were speaking. Because as soon as you leave Africa, you start to see a big difference in this. Not meaning that women never did it in other places, but a lot of the time it would just be the domain of dudes. So, as we read in Mali, a firing mound is used rather than a brick or stone kiln. Unfired pots are first brought to the place where a mound will be built, customarily by the women and girls of the village. The mound's foundation is made by placing sticks on the ground. Fast forwarding, we may think that mounds, the shape of a mound, was responsible for what the ancient Egyptian pyramids would look like, but in fact, it would be less that. Instead, these burial mounds, by the way, this is the Pyramid of Unas, not a mound, but it's the best I can give you. Egypt has been excavated so much that things, you just can't find things. But in ancient Egypt, these burial mounds would be turned to mastabas, meaning there would be flat mounds. In other words, you go from using earth to using mud earth, then brick. But this brick was used first as a small mountain, but flat at the top, because of course it's brick. And only later would they turn these bricks from the step pyramid idea of putting mound over mound over mound over mound till you get the pyramids. These are recreations of these mastabas, and as you can see, the general shape of the pyramid is starting, but of course it's flat at the top because the idea of making it a pyramid, maybe in the minds of the people it was there, but it hadn't been properly formed. What you can see though is that there's representative people inside. So there's statues inside the pyramid, there's pottery inside the pyramid, there's jewels inside the pyramid. All of that has already been developed. The pots that are going to be developed even further are going to be, let's say, the giganticizing of it, making mastaba over mastaba over mastaba. The theme or the concept to basically protect into the afterlife. Again, this is what you would call a huge waste of money if they thought it was something small in their history, but it was huge. Now, again, burial mounds are not only found in Africa, but it is interesting that the ones that are found in Africa have similar things inside their burial. This one behind is from Europe, but I want to show you the general shape that's what they were going for. You can see if you look at the mastaba and if you look at the mound that, oh, okay, it makes sense now. It kind of looks the same in how they wanted to show it. Now remember, it wouldn't have looked like this, the finished product. It probably would have been painted, it would have been plastered, and possibly because of the green around it, it would have looked, had stuff growing on it. But that's for another time. Right now, we're just talking about the general shape. This is the true nature. By the way, these mounds were probably created to avoid animals that would just dig up dead people, because that's what they used to do. You bury someone and then animals come and just dig you up and eat you. If we read on how the ancient Egyptians built pyramids, we can easily see that the most common theory, it's not even a theory, it's like just one to one, but the most common one is obviously the fact that this is what happened. You have some weirdo people with weird theories about power stations and all kinds of stuff, but this is clearly the way. And of course, if you read, the Step Pyramid was built during the Third Dynasty as the tomb of the pharaoh Djoser. It was designed by the famous architect Imhotep who was later deified. The step pyramid stands at the height of 204 feet with six step layers. It was the largest building of its time. Here, limestone was first used on the large scale as a construction material, and the idea of monumental royal tomb in the form of a pyramid was first truly realized. It can be said without exaggeration that the step pyramid complex constitutes a milestone in evolution of monumental stone architecture, both in Egypt and in the world as a whole. After the step pyramid was built, the successor of Djoser began to build pyramids as their tombs. Prior to the step pyramid, pharaohs were buried in mastaba tombs, large rectangular monuments. However, Imhotep Djoser Vizier decided that his pharaoh needed a more impressive tomb. He came up with the idea of stacking mastabas on top of one another while decreasing in length and width. The step pyramid got its name from this design of steps. Like the previous mastabas, the burial chambers are beneath the pyramid, below ground, and Egyptians created an underground structure on the scale previously unknown, quarrying out more than 3.5 miles of shafts, tunnels, chambers, galleries, and magazines. A central corridor and two parallel ones extend over 1,198 feet, connecting 400 rooms. When we talk about humans and their expiration and their burials, something that we cannot avoid talking about is how the people left behind felt. And of course, the way that some of the people left behind felt was that they needed to glorify the dead. And this brings us to the second part of the connection, which is the religious aspect of it. And the religious aspect, clearly, I mean, if you look at the guys wearing the leopard skin, clearly they're showing that there is a ancient tie between why they bury the dead the way they do and the religious practices that would come after it. The weeping women make it obvious what their role was in the tombs. And in fact, I've heard, but I haven't really looked it up myself, that they would actually hire women to come and weep. So, in other words, not all of these are actually, you know, sad women, but instead paid women who come and cry, and in some cases to inspire other people to cry, because of course they're already sad. The African men standing behind the women clearly show historical ties within Africa, but there's also a historical tie outside of Africa with some of the things that you see around them. This does not mean that they themselves are not African, because everything about them screams Africa. And this is the true history of how the pyramids were used.